Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Jess and John pod. I am Jess.
And I'm John.
And we have a very special guest for you, Stephen Semler, a producer of charts and graphs. He does policy analysis for the working class like me, so we have that in common. He's currently a senior fellow at the Center for International Policy. He's a co-founder for the Security Policy Reform Institute, CPRI. And previously, he was in the humanitarian sector. He's done some lobbying for the good guys, of course, and playing volleyball. Stephen, let's start there. Tell us about volleyball.
Yep.
The best insult I've ever received professionally was I was in Beirut at the time for grad school, and a volleyball coach there described me as having, quote, $1 million arm, but a 10-cent head.
Ooh, brutal.
And compared to the criticism I receive now in my work on Twitter, I usually just receive like death threats, and it's just really not creative. There's no real thought put into it, and I'm devastated by that, to be honest.
Would you say that volleyball criticism really set you up to take the arrows in your current line of work?
No, people are much meaner when it comes to politics, as it turns out. I was pretty much well-liked in my past life, but yeah, people tend to be very rude. But I get a lot of love and support, too, including from folks like Jess and John, so I'm happy to be here with you guys.
Oh, thanks.
Thanks, Stephen. Let's get into some of your recent articles that you've put out. We like this one. I talk a lot about the budget and government spending and what it should look like versus what it does look like. But you argued in this piece how Biden set the stage for GOP budget cuts, that he made some decisions surrounding funding and the budget that paved the way for Biden and the Republicans to make major cuts in this new budget. Can you talk a little bit about what Biden did and what cuts you're talking about there?
Sure. So in 2021, with the American Rescue Plan, we got a glimpse of what a European welfare state could look like and be like. And as a result, after the passage of the American Rescue Plan, you can actually see it on charts of economic hardship or well-being, whatever human security variable that you want to look at. You can see that after the passage of the American Rescue Plan, damn near everything improved. People's reported food insecurity, people's reported financial security, overall well-being, the number of people living paycheck to paycheck, the number of people who didn't miss or could afford a electricity bill. Everything improved after the passage of that suite of welfare programs. The problem is that none of them were made permanent. And the purpose of Build Back Better, Biden's flagship domestic agenda, was to make a chunk of those programs permanent and add new ones that were related, like free community college, that sort of thing. That agenda never passed. And you can chalk it up to, no doubt, I'll say these actors so you won't have to. Manchin, Sinema, Republicans. I'm aware that all those actors exist. However, even if you let Biden off the hook for delinking the infrastructure bill from Build Back Better, thus losing his effectively bribe to get Manchin and Sinema on board, what I looked at in that article that you referenced there was the welfare positions that were the welfare programs that were basically unicorns in that they had to be actively killed off. There was no set expiration date. So for student loans, for example, is contingent on the extension of the national emergency, which if you look at the ongoing national emergencies on Wikipedia, incredibly banal, way more than you think they are. So I didn't really see a reason why Biden had to restart the student loan crisis, basically. And that the two others that I talked about in the same piece were cuts to Medicaid and cuts to SNAP. Which are now what the GOP has very much on the table, despite what they're telling their base.
And more than that, is it the case that Biden's cuts to SNAP were deeper than what the GOP is proposing now?
In some ways, but that was my argument in the article, because it was comparing two of the most popular or likely cuts in the GOP proposal. They offered there's a leaked document from January, I believe, that was put together by the House Republican Budget Committee that just laid out a menu of options to drastically cut federal spending. It's actually quite haunting to look at the way it's dispassionately laid out like that, considering the millions of people's livelihoods that it affects. But two of the I compared two of the most likely ones to emerge from that menu to the ending of Medicaid continuous enrollment through the 2023 Consolidated Appropriations Act, which was the 2023 budget bill, basically, that the last spending bill that Democrats enacted in 2022 under the Democratic trifecta. And that bill ended continuous enrollment, which provided funding to states to say, look, you just don't kick people off Medicaid. We'll provide funding to keep them on the rolls. Just don't kick people off Medicaid during the pandemic. And then that bill, that 2023 budget bill, also killed off emergency allotments, or this extra funding for SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, formerly food stamps, that reduced benefits pretty much 60 days after the bill was passed for like 30 or 40 million people. So what I did was, effectively, my argument was like, the welfare was under assault well before the GOP took office. And the whole point of the article was just basically say, look, like, Republicans are obviously running the show now. And the cuts they're putting on the table are indeed very drastic. But if you look at some of them individually, you can tell who laid the groundwork for these. I would think that the public blowback to what Republicans are proposing now would be way more scandalous. It would be a much bigger deal among the public had Biden not effectively voluntarily gotten rid of three, really, really useful, impactful programs, them being, again, the student loan pause, the Medicaid continuous enrollment, and the extra SNAP benefits.
It's a real bummer, Stephen, but I can't say I'm surprised.
Yeah, I mean, people always let you down, man. But the thing is, like, how I view it now, I do have good news, though. The cuts that the GOP is now putting on the table through this reconciliation bill, which I can explain what reconciliation and that sort of thing is. But there's this bill that Republicans are working on that's effectively the vehicle for Trump's legislative agenda. And I'm not sure it'll pass. I sense it'll be a redux of the ACA repeal in 2017 or 2018, whatever the fuck it was. So I just think that the cuts to Medicaid and SNAP that I just discussed are so severe that it'll scare enough of them off, enough GOP members off, where the majority is so thin in the House they can't afford to lose. I don't forget what the number is, but it's not many. I think more than that will shed off, provided that the same thing happens with the ACA repeal, where people drive hours to town halls to spend 15 seconds yelling at their member of Congress to not take away their benefits or not take away these programs upon which they rely.
Those are the good old days, let me tell you what. Let's keep talking about this, bummer of a budget. It's a real red and blue tag team, it seems like, once again, on the working class out there. But there's no surprises here in the GOP budget that you're talking about. It looks like it blows up, funding for the Pentagon and police and all kinds of, scary things that are bad. It's $4.8 trillion. And, they say it's going to be paid for by reductions in spending because, of course, that's what it always is. Talk a little bit more. We talked about how Biden kind of teed this up, but tell us about the major cuts in the GOP proposal, and also what those kind of cuts would have, what effect they would have on the lives of just ordinary working class people.
Sure. So right now, the reason why I'm somewhat optimistic that this GOP bill will be killed off is because it's caused uproar in GOP districts, and it hasn't even been written yet. All we have so far is a framework for the budget, this budget resolution that you heard about being passed. What that does is it sets spending and revenue limits. So it tells certain committees how much they're allowed to increase the deficit. So for the Ways and Means Committee, for example, in the House, it says you can increase the deficit by 4.5 trillion. And that's the cost of financing Trump's, like, a permanent extension to Trump's 2017 tax cuts. Now, I'm trying to not go into a rant explaining what reconciliation is, but I might have to.
Is it like I remember when the minimum wage increase that Democrats wanted to do was killed off by some almighty omnipotent force like the Senate parliamentarian. Do they have, what is this reconciliation, if you can explain it in so many words?
Okay, that's I'm so glad you brought that up, because that is actually a really good case study that I hadn't considered before. So, back in 2021, through the American Rescue Plan, which Democrats passed through reconciliation, and reconciliation is just a process by which you can pass a bill where it's a workaround to the filibuster. The filibuster being, in the Senate, being any delay or block of legislation. So, technically, in the Senate, when a bill is voted on to is finalized, like the final votes take place, it only requires 51 votes. But in order for that final vote to take place, debate on that bill has to end. And it requires 60 votes to end the debate. So that's why it's a de facto 60 vote minimum to get partisan legislation through. Okay. Now, reconciliation, it's basically a cheat code around it, but there are conditions to it. So, for example, one of the rules of reconciliation regarding the $15 minimum wage is that it has to be about the budget. It has to be strictly about spending and revenue. And the parliamentarian in 2021 ruled that increasing the minimum wage was not about the budget. Its effects were incidental, which is the word you might hear thrown around regarding how certain things are ruled on by the Senate parliamentarian. So the ruling was that it broke the rules, and therefore it had to be excluded from it. Now, your next question is presumably, couldn't Democrats have just overruled the parliamentarian? And the answer is yes. The parliamentarian merely advises the presiding officer, whether it's the Senate Majority Leader or the Vice President, or I think it's whoever's in the throne dais thing in the Senate, on the Senate floor. The Senate parliamentarian, whose name is Elizabeth, I don't know her, but that's her name. I forget her last name. I had it memorized. I planned to drop that nugget, but it's Elizabeth. I think
I'm still stuck on. We could have just overruled this person. I mean, I feel like I got this wig on to understand why this is so broken.
Yeah, sorry, I teased you there for a bit, and then I got distracted by Elizabeth. So, okay, so you can just overrule the parliamentarian. Now, there's a reason why party leaders don't, and it's because of this. If you overrule the parliamentarian, you're basically saying the rules of reconciliation don't apply. And by extent, if you're saying the rules of reconciliation don't apply, and you can just pass any piece of legislation through reconciliation, then you're effectively blowing up, you're nuking the filibuster, which both party leaders really want to keep in place, either because they're incrementalists or they're, really conservative, and they don't want populist ideas, becoming law, like the $15 minimum wage, that easily. Or they're terrified of what the other party will do if they have a simple majority in the Senate. So you see how those two things are related? Like, reconciliation is a way around the filibuster, but if you decide that you're going to ignore the rules that are just normative, it's just like you can ignore them if you want. But the reason why Senate leaders don't is because they don't want to lose the political power of the filibuster. So if you're really in favor of eliminating the filibuster, which many people listening to the show might be, one of the ways to do it is you just delegitimize the process of effectively convincing the Senate to give the middle finger to the parliamentarian, but keeping in mind that it could work both ways. So you might get a $15 minimum wage, or you might get something really horrific coming from the GOP as well. I forget where I was going with that, but that's the explanation of reconciliation in the filibuster.
Just one quick follow-up. I mean, is this why we can't have nice things, or is it bigger than that?
No, it's Democrats. I mean, come on.
Yes.
The Democrats are, I get the Electoral College is so fucking stupid, but Democrats have such an advantage if they want it. If they listen to the left has, it's not about the numbers. It's not about our bodies and our one woman, one man, one vote, whatever. It's about our ideas. So the public option, which is basically our compromise position on healthcare, I think. I don't know. Mm-hmm. Is that right? Mm-hmm. The support for the public option is 80% or something. Even among Republicans, it's 70%, and among Democrats, it's 90 something or something crazy like that. So the left's ideas and same goes for Medicare for all. The left's ideas are so popular that the Democrats really have an advantage, because when you look at basically the economic system that we live under, capitalism, the economy has no soul. The soul and empathy comes from the regulation of the economy. I understand you two are like the last two people that needs to be said to. But speaking just off the cuff here,
I've gone under a lot of right-wing radicalization in the last week. I mean, speak for yourself, you know?
Yeah, I'm pretty much a tech bro at this point who just doesn't know how to use a computer yet. But anyway, the Democrats have such an advantage because we have solutions to people's problems, but they just won't deploy it, which is why I wrote a very long and very popular and very controversial piece on why Kamala Harris lost not too long ago. But I don't like, you can blame it on procedure. Certainly the filibuster is like under like the last administration, like in 2021 and 2022, when the Democrats had the trifecta. Of course, I guess it got out of the way, but they were passing Build Back Better through reconciliation. It was a tactical error, if you want to call it an error, to de-link the infrastructure bill from that social welfare agenda. So to me, like, I understand like Republicans are the problem. We need to elect more Democrats. Like, I'm sympathetic to that argument, but at the same time, it's like those factors exist. So for example, like, if I'm leading you through a hike in the forest and I'm the tour guide, I take your phones and I take your cigarettes and your whatever, and I put it in a plastic bag so it doesn't get wet. And there's a very clear way across the stream through just hopping on rocks. If I just plunge headfirst into the stream in front of you, ignoring the rocks right there, that would be difficult to cross, but would be manageable. If I just faceplant immediately in the stream, you would likely say, what the fuck, you know, like, why is this guy leading us? Which is a feeling I get with respect to Democrats and advancing our priorities. I don't know how you feel.
It's kind of a change of tune from when Trump was president. The method in which they, voted to spend the dollars for the CARES Act. Trump, when he was asked about this, he was like, oh, well, it's different if, we increase the debt and we vote to spend more money, because I was the president then. And the CARES Act was uniquely this policy where there wasn't this big fuss about, oh my God, raising the debt ceiling, voting to spend new dollars. It was just, we have to get this done now. We're going to get it done. Trump loved the idea of putting his names on checks that people were getting. But fundamentally, I think that's where I land on this, is they were okay with that because this was government spending that was like a temporary benefit to the working class and would ultimately make working people like Trump more, because they're like, oh my God, they're giving us money. They're giving us this economic stimulus. That's so great. Thank you, President Trump. And I think that's different from the type of federal spending that strengthens public programs, which means the working class is not as reliant on the private sector to spend all of the money they ever earn to go on and get the things that they absolutely need to survive. So it feels like that's where the Republicans certainly draw the line with these things. But then you had a Democratic administration where reconciliation seemed to be the only way they could ever get things done. And there was no one making the case that, like, hey, Trump spent this money at a time of economic downturn, and actually spending money into a stagnant economy is why we didn't have a complete recession thanks to COVID. They had the arguments right there for them, and it was kind of a gotcha for Republicans too, but they chose not to take that path, right? They chose to take the path of austerity. And if we need to rein inflation in, right, we've got to spend less. We've got to increase interest rates. And I think that was a huge mistake and like maybe the biggest waste of Biden's presidency. But can you talk more about this austerity narrative that we have? Because we've raised the debt ceiling 90 times since 1959. There hasn't really been this massive negative effect. Actually, when the budget's been balanced, like under Clinton, it brought in a time of recession and forced the private sector into massive debt. So this idea that we can't have nice things because we can't spend money is not so true, but they're totally using this as the tool to prevent us from having nice things that we work for as a country. Can you talk about just sort of the story and narrative of austerity we're being told now and how it's a continuation of what Biden did?
I don't know, Jess, I'd probably rather listen to you talk about it, to be honest.
Yeah,
but
I agree. Nice.
Yeah, I mean, I can give you like a few points. I already forget what the question was, but I think I have an idea. So,
Just like the narrative austerity. What's the story they tell
yes,
people with the public spending?
I can give you. I think one way to communicate that to people, you can do it in technical ways, like a nerd way. I can think of a couple ways to do it like that, but easy ways might include just pointing out the hypocrisy, like you were just alluding to. So, a couple examples come to mind. So, remember, like, there's a huge discussion on how to, quote unquote, pay for Build Back Better and that sort of thing in the infrastructure bill. So that was about like increasing revenue or increasing taxes to pay for something new. That is something that you only see with social spending. War spending, no. Every war since Vietnam has not been paid for by a corresponding tax increase. It's all been paid for on the credit card, the deficit. Now, because those are considered emergencies, like real emergencies, and we got a glimpse of that. Like, okay, all of our national emergencies aren't just about invading and occupying a different country. During COVID, it's like, okay, the government looks like it actually gives a shit about us. That's great. We're now just spending money like we're addressing human needs first, and we're figuring out how to pay for it later. That's basically it. But for a more specific example, one that's recent is that, like, the differences in the way that Republicans talked about stimulus payments under Trump versus under Biden. Like, under Biden, they caused inflation. We gave the working class money and they spent it, and that caused inflation. Never mind the fact that the Dallas Federal Reserve did a study and found that over 52% of people what was the numbers? So 52% of people who received the second and third economic impact payment, or let's just look at the third. So over 50% of the people who received that $1,400 American Rescue Plan stimulus used it to pay down debt. Another quarter saved it. Less than, only 20% spent it. So it was... And the people who spent it were spending on basic stuff. And you're right that it did, that spending was enough to trigger an economic upturn. But yeah, somehow that got blamed for inflation. But when Trump did it, when Trump was criticizing the $600 check is way too low, he was asking for $2,000 even. Then suddenly it was just all fine. And the reason that hypocrisy might actually come up now with respect to stimulus payments is because Trump recently, he's mentioned it, I think, twice now, this idea of a Doge dividend. I just wrote about this. That he got the idea from Musk, and Musk got it from some CEO of an investment firm who sounds like a weirdo.
Andrew Yang, definitely.
No, it wasn't Andrew Yang. No. This was like an anti-woke CEO. But the proposal would say, okay, however much money Doge and the GOP saves would be, a portion of it would be converted into tax rebates. And basically they've started polling on this thing now, because now it's gaining traction in DC, but they've done polling, and the polling is overwhelmingly positive. And as I argued in my recent newsletter, Polygraph, you can follow me on Substack, is that the only reason it's popular is because people think it's a fourth round stimulus payment. And it's not. It's basically, it's taking liquidated benefits in terms of Medicaid and SNAP and turning it into a tax cut for the rich. Now, how that relates to the current conversation is that proposal can work, but why didn't this guy take it from obvious sources of waste? Like, why didn't he take it from the department that can't pass an audit, or the department that gets over half of the discretionary budget every year? I'm talking about the Pentagon. So it's just one of these things where it's like, not only are we talking about like just the hypocrisy when it comes to the debt and deficit, that we're also just, when are we ignoring it and when we're accepting it? It's not even necessarily on partisan lines either, as the funding for the Pentagon and war spending demonstrates. I don't think I answered your question.
No, you did. That was great.
No, this is great. I have a follow-up to that. I mean, these things are often proposed to the public with the frame of like your household budget. the government is like your household. And if you're spending too much money, well, you got to tighten your belt. Can you, and they do that because it's an easy thing to think about, but can you talk about the flaws of that specific frame in thinking about things like Pentagon funding, Social Security, Medicaid, all of this?
Yeah, the short answer is none of us print our own money.
God
we don't control the world economy. You know what I mean?
Speak for yourself, Steven. I got a whole thing in the basement here.
Oh yeah. No,
I was just watching Reacher where they're like stripping the paper bills that are like ones of their ink and printing hundreds. Anyway, you're right. The federal government can print money. Households cannot. Continue.
Don't print hundreds, Jess, because they're easier. There's more scrutiny of tens, fives, 20s. It's like robbing a bank. You should know this by now.
Whoa, pro tip. You might want to move this conversation over to Signal, Stephen. I don't want to, get you in trouble for heist knowledge.
We're just playing around.
Oh, man. What were we talking about?
More complicated than that?
That's all. That's basically all I had to say. I mean, what would you add? Like, what do you tell people when, like, you hear that? Because presumably you've confronted this bullshit before and done it politely.
I'm going to cop out on that one because I'm not the smart one on this podcast. Jess, when people are asking you about money and they're like, it's like my house, right?
Yeah, I mean, even Obama was guilty of this, right? Saying the U.S. government's taking out a credit card with the Bank of China, and that's what the federal debt is. I mean, it couldn't be further from the truth. The idea that all of our national deficit is somehow foreign debt is a common belief among the average American. It doesn't work like that. It doesn't work like that at all. Congress was given the power of the purse by the federal government to add more money to the economy. If we expect the economy to grow and we're being more productive and we're producing more things of value, naturally the amount of dollars in the economy would increase as well. So it matters where you put them and what they go to. But of course, we're constantly adding money to the economy. And Congress has a careful decision to make with how they do that. But a household can't decide, we're going to add a bunch more dollars to the economy. No, they can take out a loan with the bank, but they have to pay it back. We don't have to pay the debt back to anyone. It's merely a record of all of the dollars that have ever been put out there. And I think saying it a bunch of different times is necessary for people to get it because they've been told the totally false story and so many lies about it. And so it's kind of ingrained in their head, and unlearning that, I think, requires hearing that a bunch of different times in different ways. But everything's on the line with that. Once we realize we can provide public programs for people because we're a very productive society thanks to the working class, that's, the source of it. It's not banks that are typically given charters to create money. It's working people that are producing value that keep this whole thing running. But I think, that's the whole thing. Once members of Congress are willing to actually have a functioning economy, they'll be willing to add more dollars to it without making a big hoopla. It's the biggest key to why we don't have nice things when we actually can, is this lie.
Yeah, it's a lie that's reinforced, too, by the limits that Congress imposes on itself in terms of spending annually. So, Congress passes a budget resolution every year that sets the terms of how much they can spend. And they said it purposely, the shell of how much Congress decides it can spend is a very political decision. It could spend more, as you just alluded to, but every year it creates this false threshold that they must adhere to. Sometimes it's enshrined into law. Budget resolutions aren't legally binding, but sometimes they pass a budget control act, like the Tea Party did in 2010, I think. That imposes limits on how much Congress can spend. And then the debate is then how much should go to this and how much should go to this. And it creates a whole different conversation when the conversation is much broader and should be taken a step back, as you were just talking about. I have nothing more to add. I thought what you said was brilliant.
Co-sign on that. But, while we're talking about spending more dollars, you write a lot about the Pentagon, about the anti-war coalition. And I think the GOP probably has some ideas about the Pentagon. I mean, we're hearing that Trump was going to cut it by 50%. Maybe give us your reaction to that. And also, if that is something that should be believed, given the recent plan that the GOP is considering that has to do with how much the Pentagon is funded and how many tax breaks are going to billionaires. What is your take on Trump's campaign rhetoric versus the budget?
Yeah, so Trump, I mean, you're exactly right. Like Trump literally like in the Oval Office a couple of weeks ago was like, one of the first meetings I'm going to have is with Xi from China and Putin. And I'm just going to sit down and we're going to say, why are we spending so much on nuclear weapons and military spending broadly? Generally, there's so much more stuff we could be spending on, and we should cut our military budgets in half. That, and it was a weird moment because I have nothing in common with Trump. At least I hope not many things. But that is the type of shit that I would say if I was president. You know, the difference is I would put my money where my mouth is, and that there's just no proof that he's actually after that in any serious way. I don't see it believable because there's no indication that Doge or the guy who runs Doge.
What's his name again? Elon.
He's. Whoever the Elmo Musk. He's a case study. Anyway, he's a billionaire and he's a case study for the Dunning-Kruger effect. Anyway, this guy SpaceX is now the most valuable military contractor in the world. It doesn't receive the most contracts, but not by a long shot. But investors are very clearly, betting on the fact that it will become one of the top ones now that he controls levers of power in some way. So I see no proof. I think Trump realizes that being an anti-war candidate is popular. I think he's very thankful that Democrats and Harris effectively ceded that anti-war turf to him by default, effectively. Like during that one debate, the moderator's questions were more hawkish than Trump's answers. And then Harris's answers were more hawkish than the questions. So it's an illusion that I think he realizes he's playing to, but ultimately I think it's a distraction. I think we should, heed to Joe Biden's words of wisdom, the apocryphal quote he learned from his father. Don't tell me what you value, show me your budget and I'll tell you what you value. And there's just no proof in the budget yet.
We're in this kind of insane moment, right? Like we had Trump's address to Congress. He said all these ridiculous things, including that anyone who kills a police officer gets the death penalty, just crazy stuff. But we had this big speech by Trump where all of these ideas were reinforced of how he's like a terribly unpopular president and why. He didn't say he was unpopular. He would never say that. But I think it was like he's at 42% for his approval rating, which is lower than like the past 5 presidents at this point in their presidency. And I think a big reason is people see what's happening in the stock market. They see what's happening with the trade war that's imminent. But we forget what led us to this moment. We had Joe Biden running, and you wrote a really good piece on this, how the most unpopular U.S. president got reelected. And I want to ask you about something that we've talked about on this podcast before, but there's just so much to say about it. But the narrative they were saying that the economy is great, because a lot of their indicators were pretty good when actually the working class experience of everyday people in America was shit. Can you talk about how that message on the campaign led to him losing, among other things?
I don't know how you two feel, but I feel like Trump's victory and Harris's loss were largely an effect of the two-party system where you can't really hire someone without firing someone else. You can't fire someone without hiring the other person. I basically think that Trump really never had a credible plan to fix the cost of living crisis, and I think that's being made evident now. I think things are still bad. There's still huge lines at food banks and so on. But the fact that his campaign ads and the GOP ads, attack ads on Harris, pretty much all focused on that one issue, the cost of living, and they focused on everyday tangible things. Meanwhile, Harris did it to an extent. Biden, I'm not even sure he was aware of the cost of living crisis. All he talked about was the job numbers, which were admittedly great, but it didn't, take into account that a sizable chunk of those people who are employed are homeless. I think over a quarter of homeless people have qualified in the past year of being employed. So it didn't really take a nuanced look at employment and well-being at a granular level. It was talking a lot about GDP, which people know what it is, but don't really feel it in terms of the day-to-day. What people do have an intimate relationship with is the grocery store. And they see, and their rent, they see that rent is up. Yeah, inflation's slowing down, but rent is still 20% higher than it was in 2020 or whatever. Food is 30% higher. So average food prices are 30% higher, rather. So basically, I've been trying to like think of an analogy that captures how there's a mix of like condescension, out of touch, that Democrats invoked by telling people the economy was great by their measures, while ignoring the very obvious measures like household well-being, the number of people who had insufficient funds fees in the last year, the number of people who were having difficulty paying the bills, the number of people having difficulty affording food. This wealth of well-being indicators they could have mentioned and addressed, and put a solution forward to fix all that stuff, and they didn't. So the analogy I can best think of is like, say, John, you and I are living together, and you are late for something, and if you are late for something, and this thing, if you're late to it, will cost you reputationally or financially or something bad. The reason you're running late is because you can't find your keys.
Checks out.
Me too. You're looking everywhere for it. Meanwhile, I'm just standing in the kitchen giggling at hilarious internet videos on my phone. Now, at a certain point, you look up to me and say, Stephen, please help me. My keys are lost. And then I look at you and say, your keys aren't lost. You are.
To me,
no,
I could understand how that would influence my opinion of you, Stephen, in that scenario.
I'm coming at you with this like high-minded, zenned out sort of thing, and not really helping at all to addressing your most urgent needs. You are the voter in this case,
good,
by the way.
Dummy.
The Democrats are just going, well, they've got to be somewhere.
And exactly. And the thing that I feel strongly that analogy, I think, may capture at least a bit of what I'm talking about. And the thing is, like, if that actually happened in real life, I would qualify that as a punchable offense. Just in terms of the keys. I'm not condoning violence anyway. I just think you would have the right to hit me. Jess, you would have a shot too, if you're in the same position. But for voters, like, I can't imagine how voters felt. I mean, so many voters felt just hearing how the economy was great when it wasn't. I think that really inspired a sense of rage. And now I don't know what's going to happen at all in terms of that, because Democrats aren't putting an alternative message forward, and Trump obviously is making, I mean, with the tariffs, I think all that, food insecurity and financial hardship is going to get worse as well, right? So I don't know what happens to those people who turn to Trump because he said he would put America first. I really don't know.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I mean, I just came back from a shoot in southern West. So I'm in Wheeling, West Virginia. I was on a shoot in southern West Virginia about the flooding, catastrophic flooding that took place there. Is not really in the news a lot. But this is also that our state showed up for Donald Trump, and now voters in the coal fields where he, overperformed are wondering if he's going to show up for them. And we just asked them that question, and all of them were like, we're waiting for Trump and we're not really sure if he's going to show up. That doesn't mean we're ready to consider anybody else who's on the table because we, reached out for Trump because the lack of representation was so stark here forever. We're hoping somebody who's obviously different is going to be a little bit better, but our hopes aren't very high. And I think, with the rapid pace of changes that we're seeing, the political situation, we could be in the middle of a slow moving political revolution. And I think the Democrats' mistake is that not realizing that a similar thing that happened to the GOP with Donald Trump taking it over could happen for them, God willing that it's righteous and working class based. Again, this conversation is all kind of swirling around observations you made in your article, how the most unpopular U.S. president got reelected. It's on your Substack, which is great. Polygraph. People go check it out. Just to get into, we started with those economic indicators that don't really get at the state of working class life. But then we saw a campaign, just looking back at the Democratic strategy there. It was more belt tightening and tough love for working class people and the social programs that help their condition. And then it was combined with, war spending and dredging up these people that I thought were going to be left behind when I was a kid in middle school, the Cheneys out there on the campaign trail again. And that was a strategy. Can you put more meat on the bones of how that went and what happened and why we keep seeing this be run over and over again?
I think, it's one of those questions again where I ask you two the same thing. I think for me, it did seem in 2020 that there was, I just kicked my desk. That's why it was shaking there. Nice. In 2020, there seemed to be a revolution of sort. Like you had the most even quintessentially national security establishment, war hawkish people like Hillary Clinton saying, we need to rethink the definition of security. Because right now, when we talk about security, we're talking about the military, but that clearly doesn't keep us safe. Another one of those moments where it's like, oh God, I agree with Hillary Clinton. Like not on like verbatim, like I'd say the same thing myself. I have said the same thing myself. And the campaign that Biden ran on was, read what he campaigned on like now, or have a look at the 2020 Democratic Party platform now. It seemed wildly insufficient then, which it was. But if you read it now, it's like, it's a completely different party. So my question was, and to some extent still is, when did that shift occur? When did 2020 Biden and 2020 Democrats become the 2024 iteration? Which is, this is proof in Harris's platform compared to Biden's in 2020 and the 2024 Dem Party platform compared to the 2020 version. Way more hawkish, far less ambitious on domestic policy. And if you run on that, you're basically assured to lose. So that was what I observed. I think when that shift started was after Russia invaded Ukraine and Biden decided to rebrand as a wartime president, which is all he was interested in anyway. His sandbox and what he felt most comfortable dealing with and what he derived as most meaning from and what he wanted to be remembered as was a foreign policy president. And I think that's evident in so many different ways, including like towards the end, like in the presidential debates and when he was forced to deliver public addresses and he could barely speak, when he was actually able to form complete sentences, when he wasn't totally dysphasic, it was when he was talking about foreign policy, when he was talking about democracy and Russia and Putin and China and competing with them and Trump's threat to democracy and that sort of thing. I think there was a shift that took place that Biden just decided to rebrand, just to say, no, I'm not going to do social welfare anymore. And I attempted to give credence to that argument, which is a gut feeling, by what I did last year is I plotted out the number of times Biden mentioned debt or deficit in relation to the national debt or the national deficit. And I also plotted out mentions of Build Back Better, the social welfare agenda. And it's really quite shocking, like tons of mentions of Build Back Better and no mentions of debt or deficit, unless it was talking about how Build Back Better wouldn't add to the deficit until March 2020. And then it just totally shifted. No mentions, zero mentions of Build Back Better. And keep in mind, like in February, he was still talking about Build Back Better, even though Manchin had allegedly killed it in December. So he was still campaigning. He was still fighting for it at that point. But I think he decided to rebrand at that point. And after starting in March 2022, you saw deficit and debt mentions take off. And that's when he really started talking about austerity and cutting spending and that sort of thing. It's when I think he called the stimulus checks an irony because it put money in people's pockets, but then it caused inflation. And then it wasn't until like years later, when it's far too late, when he acknowledged the even remote possibility of seller-driven inflation or corporate greed or greedflation, whatever we're calling it now. So I think Harris's platform that was ultimately unsuccessful stemmed from that Biden rebrand. And what Harris should have done is she had a solution to people's problems. She helped implement the American Rescue Plan in 2021. She didn't have to make something 1.7 trillion like that bill was, but the formula was all there. Again, like, as I said at the top of the show, you can look at all the hardship variables, whichever ones you want: poverty, child poverty, food insecurity, child food insecurity. All those things dropped dramatically after the passage of the American Rescue Plan. And once they expired during a cost of living crisis and a serious bout of inflation, they immediately got worse, to the extent that pretty much every human security variable you look at in 2023 or 2024 is worse than it was in 2020 when Biden took office, basically. So I just think that I don't see, I'm wrapping up now because I understand I've gone on quite a long rant here, but I don't see the Democrats as, however we like we've talked about them in the past, like feckless, weak, the most servile, pathetic cretins ever shat on civilization. However people have described Democrats in the past.
Go off, King.
Yeah. I don't think that applies. I think they're doing a major power play that they tried in 2016, couldn't do it in 2020 just because of the circumstances, and tried again in 2024, which is, this is a party that has a very clear vision for itself, and that vision is of a party that has no obligation to the working class. We'll talk to them. We're not afraid to go into, working class areas like Rust Belt areas like you were in West Virginia, or like I am currently in Pittsburgh. We have no problem with that, but we're not going to offer concessions anyway. There's no social contract anymore. Working class people are not they'll get basic labor protections, that sort of thing, but we aren't bending our policies to align with working class interests. And to me, that's anathema, because that's how I define my life's work and my purpose in life, generally bending U.S. politics and U.S. policy towards working class interests. So for me, I see that, and I'm appalled. For the people who don't see it, a lot of them certainly feel it, and the election results in 2024 shows it.
I think, coming from a working class family who, hates Trump, right? Because of what he says. He's a con man. We grew up in the tri-state area. He's the kind of guy that didn't pay his workers. It doesn't sit right with us. My dad was a carpenter. But we didn't feel great about Biden, right? Because we saw, and you mentioned all these metrics in your piece, on so many fronts, people were doing worse, right? You referenced the non-sufficient funds fees and overdraft fees went up to nearly a third of Americans getting hit with them. 43% of Americans were struggling, unable to pay their bills. And so with all these metrics, people weren't doing well. We've seen economic inequality get worse under Joe Biden. That's one of the things at the forefront of a lot of people's minds. And so not addressing these main issues of just making ends meet and living in a more, equal society where everyone has a fair shake, sort of what we're promised in America. No one was really excited to turn out and vote. I think you have to give people something to vote for. And I think the Democrats maybe have just assumed that they were getting the votes of the working class. It wouldn't be the first election they did that. But what do you think, if at all, was people not turning out a factor in the Democrats' loss?
Yeah. So if you make that argument that turnout was a factor, and that Harris's decision and the Democrats' broader decision to campaign on a violent and unpopular foreign policy with an unambitious and out of touch domestic policy hurt them, and for the reasons that it drove people to the couch instead of the voting booth on election day, people will point out statistics that turnout was near a record high. But we're in a different era now. You can't really compare this election to even 2016, because we're in like the mail-in ballot era. It's way more popular to have that option now. So the standard is Biden's 2020 election. And people weren't really wildly excited about him either. The vibe for both, I think, was like the people trying to talking you into them, like the volunteers. It's like they were asking you to get a flu shot. Like they had that level of enthusiasm.
The Steve Buscemi with the skateboard thing, I mean, run that one back. It's been with us for a minute, but so has this Democratic strategy.
Yeah, I did notice that it was a lot more that kind of flu shot energy was a lot more noticeable in Harris. I think that had to do with the Gaza genocide too.
Could be that.
Yeah. So turnout was lower than in 2020, and 2020 is, again, that's the standard. if Harris had even gotten like somewhat close, which means like within 1% of Biden's 2020 turnout of like his share of the eligible vote, then she would have won. But she didn't. She didn't even do like not as good. She just did bad. And I think for that, again, she didn't offer people anywhere to go, really. Trump's turnout was virtually the same. Like, he only got like less than 1%. I think it was like 0.5% that his overall vote number increased. But Harris, I mean, it was like a 3 or 4% drop, percentage point drop.
In your article, right, you were talking about a significant loss that she had, even compared to Biden, with voters who are making less than $100,000 a year. Is that right?
Yeah. Okay. Oh, yeah. That's like the main important bit. Thanks. So like Jess mentioned that like Democrats assumed they would win the working class vote. They assume that probably because they always did. Like they always got like the vote under 50K. For income or whatever the equivalent, however that's been adjusted over time. They haven't lost that vote since the early 1960s. That changed in 2024, where suddenly the majority of that group in that lower income bracket went Republican, which is really shocking. And it really should prompt a reconsideration of what this party's about. I already gave you my theory that this is a party that not just like seems like it just wants to like rid itself of the left and anti-war people and probably Arab Americans too, and immigrants. But
Sure.
I think like you can make the cases for all those groups. But I think broadly, it just doesn't want to be the party of the working class. I think it wants to be upper middle class, professional managerial class. It wants to be the party of like business, basically. It wants to have those votes, and it will appeal to those constituencies, the upper middle class people, the top 10%, the top 1%. It will make concessions with those people. Working class, no. Working class doesn't get concessions. Working class gets a lecture. So that's where Democrats are at right now, and I think that's clear. Like, I don't know if you saw Alyssa Slotkin's official response, like the Democrats' official response to Trump's crazy State of the Union. Like the person they put in front of it, Senator Alyssa Slotkin from, I think, Michigan, maybe, like referenced Ronald Reagan and like praised Ronald Reagan during it. And while she did some things right, like she referenced like things are getting more expensive because of Trump, people know that Democrats, it's just messaging that Democrats because Democrats aren't willing to put any worker-friendly policies forward that would address those most urgent needs, like overdraft fees and food insecurity. So, and then I just don't think Democrats are credible right now.
Yeah, and then you mentioned the response to Trump's speech, kind of humping Ronald Reagan just out of nowhere for no apparent reason. You have Gavin Newsom, right, who everybody knows wants to be president. I'm sure anybody who's known him for his whole life has known he wants to be president. He's got Charlie Kirk on the podcast. I mean, as right wing as you can get. One of the people most responsible for lying in service of lies, and empowering the people who are just rampaging through our collective existence, right? He has him on the podcast and is like, you've done such a good job. Can you advise my party on how to be more like you? It's almost comical at this point. It makes me think of, if you're out there listening and you haven't heard of the ratchet effect, go ahead and give that a look up. But it's basically, the right-wing parties are sprinting to the right, and the Democrats are just following them, and they're preventing a move back, away from this rightward sprint through every election cycle. And it seems to me like, we have these crypto, techno, fascists, Sig Heil salute people now, and those are the Republicans. And the Democrats now are just kind of your basic polite country club Republicans of the past. And there is just a large, diverse group of working class people who are looking at this like, can we please have something different? That's what I experience going out into the field all the time. But you left off talking about messaging. And I think, what do you make of such a heavy focus from the Democrats being on messaging after this election loss? What do you make of the focus on that?
So you know how in Washington, D.C., a lot of couples look like they could be brother and sister?
It is weird. It's uncanny.
That doesn't have anything to do with my answer. I just thought I'd bring that up.
I've never noticed that. I'm trying to remember.
Oh, I think it's bizarre.
Next time in DC, I'm going to pay attention.
A lot of seersuckers.
It's very strange. But feel free to edit that out. I just...
Oh, please. No, we're keeping it in.
I actually have a theory that incest is more of an issue in the genetic pool of America than we care to acknowledge. But anyway.
But we're keeping that in, too.
Is it because Charlie Kirk looks inbred?
Thank you. Thank you. And it's a wrap on this pod. What more can be said?
He John, looks like the Airheads logo.
Oh, that's pretty funny.
The shape of his head.
Yeah, that
is
does
look like he might float away.
That is pretty funny, actually. John, you've really let this conversation fly off the rails here, bud.
Oh, hey, it's 2025. I'm just trying to match the energy.
Anyway, in DC, the couples are siblings.
Yeah, well, it just looks that way among male-female couples. I don't notice it with same-sex couples, but it's very strange.
There's this in DC, and then there's Democrats talking about messaging being the reason why they lost. What do you think of that?
Thanks for that prompt.
Okay.
What I see, like, when you make something all about messaging, in most cases, like, if you talk to someone just who's genuinely passionate about what they do, so, like, if you ask, like, reducing the military budget and redirecting towards human needs, that's something I'm passionate about. If you talk to me about messaging, it's because I have a tangible plan that I want to market and I want to get out there and I want to figure out what is the best way to say it. Like Jess was talking about earlier, like with respect to the federal budget not being the same as a household budget. It's like you have to say it in a bunch of ways. You have to figure out what works with who and that sort of thing. Democrats are just doing messaging, but they're not bringing anything to the table. So by making the conversation about messaging, they're using it not to advance any sort of tangible solution or real solution that they have. They're just making it about messaging, like how to best make people believe that they care about them without actually having a deliverable. So that's my takeaway from it. Do I sound too cynical when I say something like that?
I think it's the appropriate amount for 2025. What do you think, Jess?
Yeah, I think that's an accurate read. Yeah, not cynical.
I mean, what makes me not cynical? You were just talking about the the speech response. I mean, we didn't mention yet,
right?
The Bernie response that got just off the charts views from that.
Right. So that's the sort of thing I'm talking about. Like Democrats aren't even taking the messaging thing seriously. It's like the solution is right there, both in terms of what they did in 2021 and what Bernie's talking about now. Do you know any numbers off the top of your head, like how many more views the Sanders video got than the one that Slotkin delivered? There's been a whole bunch of instances where that has been the case, like town halls too. Like I've seen photos juxtaposed on Twitter of like Bernie's sold out, and there's like a scant number of press people and a few other people who walked into the wrong room at some hotel convention center for Hakeem Jeffries. You know? That's basically the theme I'm seeing as of late.
They're just trying to get eggs at the buffet. Those things are still expensive. What the hell, Trump?
Yeah.
Is there a home for people who view the political scene in America like this in either party? Like, is there any candidate that is giving you hope that's running this time around?
I don't know who's running this time around, to be honest with you. I think, you know, even if there was some, like, let's be honest, to run for federal office, you have to be a bit touched in the head to want to do this.
Fair. Okay.
So that's nothing wrong. I mean, it's nothing wrong to have a psychological defect. I'm just saying that should somewhat inform how you approach politicians. I never put my hope in politicians. It's always, how do I get this person to do what I want them to do? And of course, like, it's not just every politician is the same in that regard, because some people are already, you know, more predisposed to the things you want to do. So, for example, obviously, Sanders is much more aligned with the things I want to do than Chuck Schumer, even though they kind of, you know, they've kind of both, like, kind of a bit frail and older and white. So for me, I don't put my hope in anyone in particular, but for the home, that's what I'm grappling with now. It's like, so what home are we offering these people? Like, labor unions are declining. Like, I think I just saw something, another record low. I was in a bad mood, so I just didn't want to read it further than that one. I just saw the headline. But I know, like, where is the political home for these people in terms of giving them a place to organize, giving them a place to express themselves politically that isn't just yelling at people on Twitter? How can giving people like an ability to fight for something alongside other people and having to negotiate with people and work with people you don't like, which is ultimately very rewarding, as it turns out. That's what I'm more concerned about in terms of a political home. I don't see politicians being the foundation of a domicile in that respect.
Let's talk about global politics a little bit. So, Trump and Zelensky, man. You have to say, please, Miss Dozinski. I love all of the JD Vance memes and Marco Rubio sinking into the couch. But this is a moment that I think is not the thing, but is maybe the catalyst to a restructuring of the global order. I'm going to say a hot take, and then I'll ask you a question. I can see a world where, because now we see European countries, I saw Giorgia Meloni, a fascist in Italy, being, supportive of extending NATO protections to Ukraine, which is very different from the kind of right-wing fascism we have in the United States that's very nationalist, that's very critical of any aid going to Ukraine. And Trump and JD Vance yelling at Zelensky as if they don't have some kind of stake in protecting an allied country against a genocide, in protecting our European partners. We could see a world where the United States and Putin and Russia have an alliance, and NATO starts trading more with China. Like, there could be that massive of a restructuring, in my opinion, which may be too hot of a take. But can you just talk about this European response to Trump siding with Putin and their support of President Zelensky and how this might change the global order?
I don't know, because everything, like, every new scandal is either, like, it can go either way. It's, like, completely ephemeral, or it's something that is, like, seismic and has ripple effects from years ago. Like, the stupid stuff that Trump has done years ago that we thought would just be, something that just that comes and goes, affects our politics to this day. I have no idea, Jess. I really have no idea what direction this is going to take and how this all plays out.
What about, like, specific to the military-industrial complex? Are we going to see, like, NATO countries developing more weapons, you think?
There could be more. There could be, like, a multilateral, like, European Union force. I think Europe is already planning to dramatically increase its military investment. It's already organized or at least is in the process of organizing a very, very large weapon shipment to Ukraine. Most of the military that Ukraine gets isn't from the United States. It's a common misconception. Hell of a lot of it is. I mean, make no mistake here. But I think if there's any good to come out of this, it's Europe operating independently of the United States, which I think could help quell tensions in some ways with Russia, but also Europe being committed to Ukraine's sovereignty and independence, which could help Ukraine. So I don't know. I'm just, in terms of the broader military-industrial complex, I think in Europe, I'm already seeing articles like Isabella Weber. You know her?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think what's your opinion of her?
I'm probably thinking of Isabella Weber, the sociologist.
Could be that. Or I thought it was an economist. Anyway, forget that. But basically,
my professors in college were obsessed with Isabella Weber.
Okay. I wonder if we're talking about the same person. I just don't know enough. Anyway.
Let me find the book we read on her, and maybe we're talking about the same person.
Maybe. I think we're already, and with that though, if it's this new alignment, or if just taking with the first half of what you said in terms of Europe's going into more of a militarized posture in terms of their economy and industrial policy, I see that happen, but I also see countries that do that are effectively electing to do what Joe Biden did, which is pair social welfare cuts with a rapidly expanding military state, and counting on the jobs created from those massive military investments to mitigate the effects of social welfare cuts. That worked a bit under Reagan, but it doesn't work. It didn't work, last year, the year before, or the year before that either. And it's because even though the military budget is like 220 billion higher in real terms now than it was under Reagan, the amount of people employed by the arms industry is way lower. So in 1985, there were 3 million people employed by the arms industry. Now there are about 1 million. So the benefit that comes from massively increasing military spending isn't just paying off in the way it should. And plus, like, a lot of the increases just went to existing jobs, didn't really necessarily create new ones. And, arms industry being, technically private firms, they continue to lay off people. So it's just, I fear that the longer this war drags out and the less interested Trump seems in participating in it, and the more Europe has to compensate, I fear of the direction of politics that takes, because I see that benefiting fascism more than I do something better.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's, not to mention the obvious fact too, that like, if we are going to get, base all of our economic development off of manufacturing bombs, these bombs have got to fall somewhere. And, we're currently watching this genocide play out. And, the thing to me is like, there's never any scrutiny on like basing your economy on a giant military industrial complex, where there would be scrutiny on basically using the same principle by going back to like the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Works Progress Administration, these, public jobs programs where public dollars are employing people to build things that have a lot more social value than weapons. But that's never the case. And there's like this huge double standard for both of those. It's very frustrating.
Here's a data point for you. So in 16 months, more public funds were sent to weapons manufacturers than Biden's infrastructure bill invests in total over 5 years.
Just one more time, because that's quite a statistic. What was it again?
Okay, so just context for this statistic. More than half of the annual military budget goes to private sector contractors to make military equipment mostly, but it's also, services too, operational support and that sort of thing, sometimes personnel. So because the US military budget is so massive, every year that it passes, and given the fact that such a high percentage of that budget goes to private sector contractors, what you're seeing every year is a massive, massive redistribution of wealth from the public to private sector. And money is so vast that in just over a year, the amount of money that gets sent to military contractors through this just, basic process, the budget process, is more than the total amount of new spending that was in Biden's infrastructure bill.
Crazy.
Pretty
crazy statistic.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, okay, on the Isabella Weber front, I went to this MMT conference, MMT, Modern Monetary Theory, and it was in Berlin. So naturally, everyone was talking about Isabella Weber. I know her because she talked about price controls around the same time that Stephanie Kelton was referencing James Galbraith and price controls around inflation. So she's like relatively new, but aligned with our thinking on the economy. But I think that there's something to this idea of like, to fight fascism, right? Because she's German, she's thinking about the rise of fascism as well. Like, you need anti-fascist policies on every single front. It can't just be on like the identity politics front. It needs to be about the economy as well. And I think like the Democrats failed to do that. And that's something that like we can learn from Germany and apply to America, but like the Germans should have learned that lesson. And I remember there being like this desperate feeling in Berlin of like, we're doomed, basically. Like, it's impossible to learn this lesson. And I don't want to say that that's where like the US is heading, but I do think unless we correct for all of the things we've talked about on this podcast, like we're going to be in that same position of being in a doomful place because we don't have an anti-fascist opposition. And like we live in a country where the idea of Antifa as an organization has just become illegal. Like you can't be Antifa in the United States.
Ah, damn. I was really counting on that to spice up the next couple of years.
Like there's people who genuinely believe this is like an actual organization of violent radicals. And so I think that's really crazy. But in my old magazine we reviewed in a podcast episode not too long ago, they were cheeky in saying that the United States, if it ever has a fascist movement rise, it would have to be called something like anti-fascism for it to take hold. Turns out that's not so true. They're doing the Psych Hail in their fucking meetings, and they're openly fascist.
Yeah, Charlie Kirk was cracking into the books, the old history books there, maybe on PragerU.
Yeah. Reading and trying not to harm the weak bone structure in his hands from the genetic flaws that emerge from
noticeably weak bone structure in those hands. Well, Stephen, this has been a wonderful, light conversation about all of the world's problems. I think we got her, fairly squared away there. We're going to look alive. We're going to stick together and win nice shit so a bunch of weird billionaires don't pull a Germany 2.0 on anybody. But never mind that. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what you're doing for fun these days, Stephen? And really, you can answer anything you want here, but what are you getting into these days to keep the mood light and not like the news?
Well, before I answer that, I'd just like to say, like, it was cool. It's cool being on this podcast and just being in alignment with, people I have a lot of respect for. And that's what we need more of, people, in a column, aligned and working towards a common objective, like the human centipede.
Yes, but good and for justice.
I've never seen the movie.
I think you had me with the key analogy. I just don't know about this one, Steve.
Yeah, I think I messed that up. I think I had a bad one about that.
We're all
Do
just
not
eating
Google
shit
this
every day.
Yeah. Well, anyway, keeping it light. Honestly, like, are you familiar with the expression "pig and shit"?
Fill me in.
Like they're happy and rolling around. Like
happier than pig and shit.
Oh yes.
That I deal with heavy topics. Whether we're anytime you look at the U.S. budget and see how money is actually spent and the politics around it, it's going to get pretty dark at times. But there's an extent to which I hope this isn't like a sign of a really serious flaw, but there's an extent to which I'm happy being unhappy. And I think I thrive in that chaos, in that really dark, grim atmosphere. And I think I really am at my best. And I honestly kind of enjoy myself, and I see great value in it. It's not like I'm having fun, like I'm riding a brilliant roller coaster or something. I mean, I'm still just sitting at my desk, but
like a terrible haunted house, perhaps.
Yeah, sort of.
It's like when you listen to sad music when you're feeling sad and just kind of revel in it.
Yeah. Sometimes you just need a good cry.
Yeah.
Deeply relatable.
There is. Yeah. And what that sad music is, like the
budget.
Yeah, something like that. But in terms of like hobbies, I mean, they're great. I always have the consistent ones that I do, like the staples that everyone has, like hanging out with friends or playing sports recreationally or something like that. I do those things. I do both those things. But I always try to keep one that's a bit weird that kind of comes and goes. So now I'm trying to. I've basically taken to ordering like these 1 milliliter, 2 milliliter fragrance samples off the internet and trying to develop my nose, as in like being able to distinguish scents.
Oh,
so I am smelling very good right now.
That is incredible. Do you mean as in how you smell to other people, or how your nose works, or both?
Oh, both. Yeah. So I meant I'm giving off a very pleasant odor right now. I just want to reassure the listeners at home of that.
You really delivered on this question. When I asked, "What do you do for fun?" and you testing out, perfume scents on the internet. I think this is it's a hyper specific thing that has opened my eyes to maybe improving what I do for fun in these dark and trying times.
Stephen, we stink. I don't know if you knew that about me and John.
They haven't invented smell-o-vision yet. DARPA hasn't got to that at the Pentagon. Somebody needs to call Al Gore.
What I like about it, though, is like I enjoy the process of like figuring out what scents are and be able to like pick up like, oh, that's vanilla, or that's bergamot or ambroxan or whatever. And I like guessing and then reading reviews to see what I got right. And when people, normally when people write reviews, it's normally, boring, but people reviewing fragrances they all try to be poets. It's brilliant. It's just brilliant. Even the bad ones I enjoy. So that's my new thing. But I might go back to, I don't know, like woodworking. Maybe I was thinking about building a guillotine and then wheeling it outside Elon Musk's office, outside the Eisenhower building at the wing in the White House.
I think
we'll divert that one to Signal. Now, Stephen, if you ever want to come join our volleyball league, just 1 hour away from you in Pittsburgh and Wheeling, West Virginia, I would like to offer that to you. But until then, where can our guests find more of your work? Do you have any shameless plugging to do?
I love Wheeling. Find me on Substack, Polygraph. That's nothing to do with the polygraph test. It's just I make a lot of graphs, and I don't know. Just the name it's a stupid joke, but it just seems to work. So follow me there, Polygraph on Substack, and it's just my name at Steven Semler on Instagram, on Twitter, on Blue Sky. I don't think I'm on any other social media sites, but you can check.
For fake accounts.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for being on the show, Stephen. We will smell you later.
All right.
Smell all y'all later.
We look forward to smelling you one day in person.
Cosign.
We should end every episode with that.
I think so. I think we just found our new ending on the John and Jess pod. Take us out of here, house band.
All right, everyone. That was Stephen Semler, Stephen the Smeller, and
the Smeller. We're smelling all kinds of stuff these days.
And now's the fun part of our show, where I ask John what he's been working on. John, what have you been working on?
Oh, hell yeah! Well, thanks for that question. I have been working on a story that you might not have heard about because it hasn't been in the news, and this is the catastrophic flooding in southern West Virginia. Shout out to More Perfect Union for picking up the story, sending me down there. I followed around two people I know well, Zach Shrewsbury and Brandy Reese of Blue Jay Rising. Look them up, by the way. They are coordinating a lot of the aid that needs distributed down in southern West Virginia. There was torrential rainpour that hit Appalachia. There were 22 deaths in Kentucky, 3 in West Virginia. But really, we went down there to ask people how they're getting along. But, of course, what we found out is there's a ton of devastation everywhere from this flood. And that's the devastation that's just in the short term. But really, the whole area has been neglected over the long term forever. This area has been forgotten about. There hasn't really been political representation. It's been, the playground of billionaires, right? That's where the southern part of the state is, where all the coal was mined out of, timber was taken off of the land forever. And we found a couple interesting things. I mean, mountaintop removal has been happening downstate for a long time. And one of the ways that impacts flooding is they blow the tops of these mountains off. They fill in the streams below, and they make all of these slurry ponds that house toxic runoff from these mining operations. We're talking about the Appalachian Mountains, some of the oldest in the world. Something like 500 mountaintops have been blown up, creating these slurry ponds everywhere, that when rain hits, the toxic crap in those ponds flows out into the water streams that are already struggling from coal mining pollution. You know, billionaires come in here, they take the money, they leave a mess. It's been the story forever in that part of the state, happening to people who are doing the work and making all the billions of dollars for the companies that have really run this state forever. So, you know, on top of that, you don't have a lot of media covering this. A lot of the media that does cover Southern West Virginia looks at the people there as poster children. There's a lot of poverty porn whenever cameras do show up in the state. And of course, they rarely show up when they're needed most after these disasters. We talked to some really amazing people. I was talking about in Steven's interview there that this is an area voted heavy for Donald Trump. And now a lot of people are saying, we showed up for him, but we really don't think he's going to show up for us. And nobody has in the past. And I left that shoot thinking, you know, there's a really large appetite out here for political representation, for somebody to come through and accurately reflect the problems and the neglect that have been part of that region, part of this state, all across the whole country. And, you know, I think things can seem very set in stone, but there are ingredients out there for, you know, a populist person on the left to come in and really redefine what it means to represent places that have been forgotten for so long. So it's going to be coming out. It's a quicker shoot. It'll come out in the next week or two. And that is what I have been working on. Jessica, same question to you. What's been on your mind? What have you been up to? Tell us what you've been working on.
Well, I've been getting leaks from the government. FEMA, for one. It's going to be a much worse situation when hurricane season hits, but like, you've got West Virginia experiencing this disaster, and FEMA's got how many less employees in the doggy firing spell? It left them with hundreds less, is what I've been told. So it's, you know, less emergency managers to deal with situations like this. Not very efficient. Anyway, I've been on vacation. I went to Jordan Newell's wedding. It was a beautiful wedding. I was in California, and I came back here, and it's been snowing for like 3 days. But while I was in California, I came across a story. I got a news tip from someone in the area, and it turns out there was Luigi Mangione 2.0. I won't call them that because Luigi Mangione, of course, is not guilty. But
Allegedly.
Whoever shot the United Healthcare CEO, a copycat of that guy. It turns out SAFE, which is like the largest workers' compensation insurance agency in Oregon. He lives in this like bougie suburb of Portland, Lake Oswego. Around 4 a.m. on Friday, February 21st, someone shot up his house. He was fine. No one was injured. But clearly this was some kind of message being sent. The police will not tell me what was sent in a threatening email to him, but he did share with the employees of SAFE that this happened. His house was shot up. So I don't think you're trying to kill someone if you shoot up their front door. I do think a message was trying to be sent.
And a message probably received.
Yeah. So they're staying scared. And I think there's a reason that this didn't get picked up for national news. I found it 5 days after it happened. So I have a feeling that like national news does not want to report on copycats and give the general public any ideas.
Yeah, they probably heard about our pal K Clips out there talking about media paternalism and censorship.
Mm-hmm.
Taking notes from our buds here on the JJ Pod.
JJ Nation.
JJ Nash, how we doing out there, Nash?
Nash, let us know how you're doing. I think that's all we have for this episode. It's been great chatting with you all about the budget and the country and smells.
The smells. Until then, everybody, that's all she wrote.